A Tale of Werewolves, Alphas, and Fated Destinies, written by Olivia Stone. The forest was quiet in that particular way that made Lyra Nightshade's instincts scream danger. The kind of silence that came not from peace, but from predators lurking somewhere close enough that even the birds had stopped singing and the small creatures had gone still in their burrows, waiting for whatever violence was about to unfold to pass them by, so they could return to their simple lives of survival. She should have turned back the moment she noticed it, should have gathered up her half-filled basket of medicinal herbs and returned to her cottage on the edge of Shadowmoon Pact territory, where she could lock herself away from whatever trouble was brewing in these woods. But Lyra had never been particularly good at doing the smart thing when it came to her own safety, a fact that Derek had thrown in her face 6 months ago when he rejected her in front of the entire pack during what was supposed to be their engagement party. She could still hear his voice sometimes when she was alone in the quiet hours before dawn, could still feel the burning shame of standing there in her best dress while he announced to everyone that she was too obsessed with animals, too soft-hearted, too focused on healing broken things instead of building the kind of political connections and social power that a beta's mate needed to cultivate if she wanted to be useful to the pack's future leadership. He'd made it sound like her compassion was a character flaw rather than a virtue, like her gift for soothing injured creatures and her extensive knowledge of healing herbs was somehow less valuable than the ability to smile prettily at visiting alphas and remember which wolves were related to which powerful families and navigate the endless, exhausting maze of pack politics that had always made Lyra feel like she was drowning in quicksand. The rejection had been devastating, but what came after was somehow worse, the way her own pack had sided with Derek without hesitation, agreeing that yes, she was strange. Yes, she was too different with her long silver hair that fell past her waist like a waterfall of moonlight, and her pale porcelain skin that seemed to glow in certain light, and her storm-gray eyes flecked with silver that made people uncomfortable when she looked at them too directly, as if she could see straight through to their souls and find them wanting. Her parents had been traveling healers with the same unusual coloring, and they'd taught her from childhood that being different was a gift, that their appearance marked them as special in the eyes of the moon goddess, chosen for the sacred work of healing and helping others. But when they died in a rogue attack when Lyra was only 16 years old, she'd learned quickly that being different without the protection of people who loved you was just another word for being vulnerable, for being other, for being the kind of wolf that packs tolerated rather than treasured. The Shadowmoon Pack had taken her in after her parents' death because moon goddess law demanded it, because abandoning a young Omega to die alone would bring shame and potential divine punishment. But they'd never really wanted her, never made her feel like she belonged. And after Derek's very public rejection, they'd made it abundantly clear that she was being kept around only because exiling her would look bad, and because occasionally her healing skills proved useful enough to justify the minimal resources they grudgingly provided for her survival. So now, Lyra lived alone in her parents' old cottage, a small wooden structure that sat right at the edge of pack territory where the carefully maintained paths gave way to wild forest. And she spent her days working odd jobs for wolves who barely looked at her, and her nights caring for the injured wildlife she brought home to the basement she'd converted into a rehabilitation center, pouring all the love and care she had to give into creatures who didn't judge her appearance or find her compassion inconvenient or tell her she wasn't good enough to deserve basic kindness and respect. She had a fox down there right now, recovering from a trap injury, and a young hawk with a broken wing that was healing nicely after 3 weeks of careful treatment, and a doe who'd been hit by a cart on the main road and needed another few days of rest before Lyra could release her back into the forest. and caring for them gave her a sense of purpose that nothing else in her life provided anymore. A feeling that at least someone in this world was better off because she existed. The pack members who knew about her hobby thought it was further proof of her strangeness, more evidence that she was too focused on things that didn't matter. But Lyra didn't care what they thought anymore, or at least she told herself she didn't care, even though their whispers and sideways glances still stung like salt in an open wound, and she still sometimes woke up in the middle of the night feeling crushingly, devastatingly alone, in a way that made her chest ache and her throat close up with tears. She refused to let fall, because crying about it wouldn't change anything, and she'd learned long ago that the world didn't care about the pain of people like her. The basket in her hands was half full of yarrow and comfrey root, plants she needed to replenish her medical supplies, and she'd been mentally cataloging what else she needed to gather when the silence had fallen like a heavy blanket over the forest, stopping her in her tracks and making every nerve in her body stand at attention the way they always did when something was wrong. She stood perfectly still for a long moment, barely breathing, listening for any sound that might give her a clue about what had frightened away all the normal forest noise. And that's when she heard it in the distance, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the trees. The unmistakable sounds of combat, of snarling and howling, and the meaty thuds of large bodies colliding with violent force, of a fight that sounded far more serious than a simple territorial dispute between rival packs or a dominance challenge between two wolves trying to establish their place in the hierarchy. This was something else entirely, something that made her wolf instincts scream at her to run in the opposite direction as fast as her legs could carry her, to get back to her cottage and lock the doors and pretend she'd never heard anything at all, because getting involved in unknown wolves' business was an excellent way to end up dead, and Lyra had quite enough problems in her life without adding her own murder to the list. But even as her rational mind was telling her to flee, even as every survival instinct she possessed was demanding that she save herself and let whatever was happening in those trees remain someone else's problem, she heard something else that cut through her fear like a blade through silk, a sound that was different from all the aggressive snarling and combat noise, a yelp of pain that was sharp and desperate and somehow young, the kind of sound that spoke of serious injury rather than simple battle wounds, of a creature that was dying rather than just fighting. Lyra's healer instincts, the ones her parents had carefully cultivated over years of training, the ones that had been both her greatest gift and her most inconvenient curse, flared to life inside her chest with such intensity that she actually gasped, her free hand flying up to press against her sternum as if she could physically push down the overwhelming need to help, to heal, to do something about whatever creature was suffering in those woods. Her parents had always told her that those who can heal have a duty to heal, that the moon goddess gave certain wolves special gifts not for their own benefit, but so they could serve others. And even though Lyra had spent the last 6 months learning in painful detail that serving others rarely resulted in gratitude or kindness in return, even though she knew on an intellectual level that walking toward danger was the kind of stupid decision that got soft-hearted Omegas killed, she found her feet moving before her brain could finish constructing all the very good reasons why this was a terrible idea. She moved through the forest as quietly as she could manage, setting down her basket of herbs at the base of a large oak tree so she could move faster and more silently, following the sounds of combat that were already starting to fade, as whatever fight had been happening apparently reached its conclusion. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen autumn leaves that crunched softly under her boots no matter how carefully she stepped, and she had to push through thick undergrowth that caught at her cloak and her long silver hair. But she kept moving forward because that pained yelp was still echoing in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that if she didn't help, if she turned away now, She would regret it for the rest of her life, in a way that would make Derek's rejection feel like a minor inconvenience in comparison. She'd been walking for maybe 10 minutes, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, when she finally saw the signs of the battle that had taken place. Blood splattered across tree trunks and rocks, deep claw marks gouged into the earth where someone had been thrown or dragged, patches of fur stuck to rough bark, and the bodies of what looked like 3 rogue wolves lying motionless on the ground, their throats torn out and their eyes already glazing over with death, which told Lyra that whoever they'd been fighting was a skilled and dangerous combatant. Probably an alpha, or at least a very experienced warrior. Definitely not someone she wanted to encounter if they were still in an aggressive state. But the pained sound came again, weaker this time, barely more than a whimper, and Lyra forced herself to keep moving forward, climbing over a fallen log and pushing through a dense thicket of brambles that left scratches on her arms and caught in her cloak, until she finally emerged into a small clearing and saw what had made that terrible sound. There was a ravine ahead of her, a deep crack in the earth that had probably been carved out by spring floods over countless years, and at the bottom of it, partially hidden by fallen branches and dead leaves, was a wolf, but not just any wolf, because this creature was absolutely massive, easily twice the size of any normal wolf she'd ever seen, with thick silver fur that seemed to shimmer even in the dim forest light, and a powerful, muscular build that screamed alpha dominance or elite warrior training. He was clearly badly injured, his left hind leg twisted at an unnatural angle that made Lyra's stomach turn just looking at it, deep gashes across his ribs that were bleeding freely and matting his beautiful silver fur with crimson. And most concerning of all, she could see dark veins spreading from his wounds like poisonous roots under his skin, black lines that marked him as a victim of silver poisoning or some other kind of toxin that was far more dangerous than simple combat injuries because it meant this wasn't just a fight, it was an assassination attempt. The wolf's eyes opened as she approached the edge of the ravine, and Lyra found herself staring into the most striking ice blue gaze she'd ever seen, intelligent and aware in a way that confirmed this was definitely a shifter rather than a true wolf. Someone who understood exactly what was happening to him and knew that he was dying unless someone helped him very, very soon. He tried to growl at her, a weak warning sound that told her to stay back, to leave him alone. But the effort made him cough, and more blood bubbled up from his mouth, and Lyra felt something crack open inside her chest at the sight of this magnificent creature reduced to such a broken, suffering state. She should walk away, should leave him here, because getting involved with an unknown alpha's problems was suicide, because for all she knew, he was a criminal or a rogue or someone who'd earned his injuries through terrible deeds, because helping him might make her a target for whoever had done this to him, because she had no way of knowing if he would turn on her the moment she got close enough for him to reach. But looking into those intelligent blue eyes, seeing the pain and the resignation there, the way he'd already accepted that he was going to die alone in this ravine, and there was nothing he could do about it, Lyra knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't walk away, couldn't leave him to suffer, couldn't be the kind of person who valued her own safety over another creature's life. Because if she made that choice, if she turned her back on him now, then Derek would have been right about her all along, right that she was weak and useless and not strong enough to make the hard decisions, and she would rather die trying to help than live, knowing she'd failed the most fundamental test of her character. "I'm going to help you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper as she carefully began climbing down into the ravine, using exposed roots and rocks as handholds, while trying not to think about how badly this could go wrong, How easily he could kill her if he decided she was a threat. I know you're scared. I know you don't know me. I know you probably want me to leave you alone. But I can't do that. I can't just walk away and let you die here. So please, please don't fight me on this. Just let me help you. And then you can go back to wherever you came from, and we never have to see each other again. But first, I need to get you out of this ravine and back to my cottage where I have proper medical supplies and a safe place for you to heal. The wolf watched her with those impossibly blue eyes as she spoke, his gaze tracking her descent into the ravine, and she half expected him to lunge at her the moment she got close enough. But instead, he just lay there, breathing hard and bleeding, and clearly too weak to do much of anything except watch as this strange, silver-haired Omega with a death wish climbed down to save him from a fate he'd already accepted. When Lyra finally reached the bottom of the ravine and knelt beside him, close enough now to see the full extent of his injuries and feel the fever heat radiating from his poisoned body, close enough that he could easily snap her neck if he wanted to, the wolf let out a long, shuddering breath that might have been resignation or relief or simply exhaustion. And then, to her absolute shock and profound relief, he very slowly, very deliberately, lowered his head and rested it against the ground in a gesture of submission, of trust, of acceptance that she was here to help rather than harm. And Lyra felt tears prick at her eyes because in that moment, this dying wolf, who had no reason to trust anyone, trusted her, and that was more validation of her worth than she'd received from her entire pack in the 6 months since Derek had thrown her away like garbage. She worked quickly, knowing that every second counted with the poison spreading through his system, fashioning a crude stretcher from her cloak and some thick branches she found in the ravine, talking to him the entire time in a soft, soothing voice, explaining what she was doing and why, telling him about her cottage and her rehabilitation center, and promising him that she had medicine that could counteract the poison if she could just get him there in time. The wolf never took his eyes off her face, watching her with that intense blue gaze that made her feel seen in a way she hadn't felt in longer than she could remember, as if he was memorizing every detail of her appearance, every word she spoke, filing it all away for reasons she couldn't begin to understand. Getting him onto the stretcher was agonizing for both of them, every movement making him whimper with pain that clearly went far deeper than just his physical injuries, but he didn't snap at her or fight her, just endured it with a stoicism that spoke of extensive combat training and a will strong enough to push through suffering that would have broken lesser wolves. Dragging him out of the ravine was even worse, Lyra's muscles screaming in protest as she hauled his massive weight up the steep incline, using every ounce of strength she possessed, her hands raw and bleeding by the time she finally got him to level ground. But she didn't stop, couldn't stop, because she could see the poison spreading further with every passing minute. And she knew that if she didn't get him to her cottage soon, if she didn't start treatment immediately, then all of this effort would be for nothing, and he would die anyway, and she would have failed to save him despite giving everything she had. The journey back through the forest took hours, Lyra stopping frequently to catch her breath and adjust her grip on the stretcher, her entire body shaking with exhaustion and her legs threatening to give out beneath her. But every time she thought about giving up, about leaving him here and going for help, she would look down at his face and see him still watching her with those blue eyes, still trusting her, still believing she could save him, and she would find the strength to keep going for just a little bit longer. She talked to him constantly during that endless trek, partly to keep him conscious, and partly because the sound of her own voice kept her focused and prevented her from thinking too hard about how insane this was, how she was risking everything for a wolf she didn't know, how her pack would probably exile her if they found out she'd brought an unknown alpha onto their territory without permission. But none of that seemed to matter as much as getting him to safety, as keeping him alive, as proving to herself that she was capable of saving something this broken. She told him about Derek's rejection, about how she'd felt standing there in front of everyone, while the man who was supposed to love her announced that she wasn't good enough, about how she'd spent 6 months feeling worthless and alone and wondering if maybe they were all right. Maybe she really was too damaged and too different to deserve love or belonging or basic kindness from anyone. She told him about her parents and how much she missed them, about how her mother had taught her which herbs could heal and which could kill, about how her father had shown her how to set broken bones and stitch deep wounds, about how they'd both believed that healing was the highest calling a wolf could aspire to, and that using your gifts to help others was the only way to give your life true meaning. She didn't know why she was confessing all of this to a dying wolf who couldn't respond, didn't know if he even understood what she was saying, or if the poison had already damaged his mind beyond recognition. But something about his steady gaze made her feel like he was really listening, really hearing her in a way that no one else had bothered to do in longer than she could remember. And so the words just kept spilling out of her like water from a broken dam. Everything she'd been holding inside for months finally finding release. They were almost back to her cottage. Lyra could see the familiar outline of the small wooden structure through the trees ahead when they encountered 2 patrol wolves from the Shadow Moon pack making their evening rounds, and Lyra's heart dropped into her stomach because this was exactly the confrontation she'd been dreading. The moment when she'd have to explain what she was doing, dragging an enormous unknown alpha through pack territory. And she knew without a doubt that this was going to go very, very badly. The 2 wolves, both young males she vaguely recognized from pack gatherings, but had never bothered to learn the names of, shifted to their human forms as they approached. Their expressions shifting from bored routine to shock, and then to suspicion as they took in the sight of Lyra covered in blood and dirt, her hands raw and bleeding, dragging a massive silver wolf on a makeshift stretcher. "What the hell is this?" the taller one demanded, his voice sharp with the kind of authority that came from believing he was important and that Omegas like Lyra existed to obey his commands. "Who is that wolf? Where did you find him? What are you doing bringing an outsider onto our territory without authorization?" Lyra straightened her spine, trying to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel, trying to channel the fierce protectiveness she felt for the injured wolf into something that might convince these idiots to leave her alone. "I found him on the edge of our territory, injured and dying," she said, keeping her voice as steady as she could manage despite her exhaustion and fear. "I'm taking him to my cottage to treat his wounds, which is my right under pack law since my property is technically my territory, and I can bring anyone I want onto it without requiring permission from anyone." The shorter patrol wolf laughed, a cruel sound that made Lyra's skin crawl, and she saw the way his eyes traveled over her silver hair and pale skin with obvious disgust. The same look she'd seen on countless faces over the years. The look that said she was other, wrong, not quite wolf enough to deserve respect. "Your property?" he sneered, stepping closer in a deliberate attempt to intimidate her. "You mean the cottage we let you live in out of pity? You really think you have any rights here, freak? You're lucky we haven't kicked you out already after that embarrassing display at Derek's engagement party, standing there crying like a pathetic child because he finally had the sense to reject you." The words stung more than Lyra wanted to admit, hitting all the vulnerable places inside her that still hadn't healed from Derek's rejection. But she forced herself to hold her ground, forced herself to meet the patrol wolf's eyes, even though her own were burning with unshed tears of anger and humiliation. "Pack law is pack law," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "My parents owned that cottage. It passed to me when they died. And unless Alpha Marcus wants to formally seize it and make me completely homeless, then yes, it is my property, and I have every right to bring this wolf there for treatment." The taller patrol wolf moved closer to the stretcher, looking down at the injured silver wolf with an expression that made Lyra's blood run cold, a combination of calculation and casual cruelty that spoke of someone who enjoyed having power over others and wasn't afraid to use it. "Why waste resources on an outsider?" he asked, though the question seemed to be directed more at his companion than at Lyra. "We should just kill it now, put it out of its misery. One less problem for the pack to worry about." His hand moved toward the knife at his belt, and Lyra acted without thinking, throwing herself between the patrol wolf and the stretcher, her arms spread wide in a protective gesture that was probably suicidal, but felt absolutely necessary in that moment. "You are not touching him," she said, and her voice came out stronger than she'd expected, hard and cold and absolutely certain. "He's under my protection now, and if you want to kill him, you'll have to go through me first, and then you'll have to explain to Alpha Marcus why you murdered an Omega under his protection, which I'm pretty sure violates about 6 different pack laws, and would give him grounds to execute you both for insubordination and unauthorized violence." The 2 patrol wolves exchanged glances, clearly not having expected resistance from the weird silver-haired Omega who usually kept her head down and avoided conflict at all costs, and Lyra could see them weighing their options, trying to decide if killing her and the wolf was worth the potential consequences. Finally, the shorter one shrugged and stepped back, his expression making it clear he thought she was an idiot, but wasn't willing to risk his own neck over it. "Your funeral," he said with a nasty smile. "But when that thing wakes up and tears your throat out, don't come crying to us for help, and don't expect the pack to avenge you, because as far as we're concerned, you stopped being our problem the moment you decided to bring an unknown alpha into your home." They walked away laughing, making crude jokes about how Lyra was probably so desperate for male attention after Derek's rejection that she was willing to risk her life for a wolf who would kill her the moment he regained consciousness. And Lyra stood there shaking with a combination of fury and fear and exhaustion until they were out of sight, until she was sure they weren't coming back to finish what they'd threatened. Then she looked down at the silver wolf, whose blue eyes had been watching the entire confrontation with that same intense focus, and she saw something in his gaze that she couldn't quite name. Something that looked almost like approval, or perhaps respect, as if he'd witnessed how she'd stood up for him and found her worthy in some way that mattered. "Come on," she whispered, gripping the stretcher again despite her screaming muscles and bleeding hands. "Let's get you inside before anyone else shows up to question my life choices." The final stretch to her cottage felt both endless and too short, Lyra's mind racing with everything that could still go wrong, with the very real possibility that the patrol wolves were right and she was about to die for her stupidity. But she refused to let those thoughts stop her now. Not when she was so close. Not when she'd already come this far. She managed to drag him up the cottage steps and through her front door, then carefully maneuvered the stretcher across her small living room to the door that led down to her basement rehabilitation center. And that's when the truly difficult part began, getting his massive weight down the narrow stairs without injuring him further or losing control of the stretcher and sending them both tumbling to the bottom. It took her nearly 30 minutes to safely descend those stairs, moving one careful step at a time, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and her vision starting to blur from fatigue. But finally, she reached the bottom and was able to drag him into the main area of her rehabilitation center, a large, open space lit by oil lamps and heated by a small wood stove, filled with the cages and enclosures that housed her current patients. The fox lifted his head from his bedding and watched with curious eyes as Lyra carefully transferred the silver wolf from the stretcher to a pile of clean blankets she kept for larger animals, and the hawk ruffled his healing wing with interest, and the doe stamped her foot once in acknowledgement of the new arrival. And Lyra felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in her throat because this was her life now, apparently, caring for a basement full of broken creatures while her own pack treated her like trash, and she risked execution by hiding an enormous unknown alpha in her home. She locked the basement door behind her, not to trap the wolf, but to keep anyone else from coming down unexpectedly. And then she went to work with the focused efficiency her parents had drilled into her during years of training, gathering her medical supplies and laying them out within easy reach, heating water on the small stove, preparing the herbs and tinctures she would need to counteract the poison spreading through his system. The wolf watched her move around the space with those blue eyes that never seemed to blink, never seemed to lose focus, and Lyra found herself talking to him again as she worked, explaining each step of her process, telling him what she was about to do and why, promising him that the pain would get worse before it got better, but that if he could just hold on, just trust her a little longer, she would save him. She would fix this. She wouldn't let him die after everything they'd both been through to get him here. She started with the poison, carefully cleaning the deep gashes on his ribs and examining the dark veins that had spread from the wounds. Her healing sense, that magical awareness her mother had taught her to tap into, telling her that this was definitely silver-based poisoning, but mixed with something else. Something herbal and unfamiliar that made it even more dangerous than standard silver exposure. She applied a paste made from carefully measured amounts of activated charcoal, milk thistle, and bloodroot, a mixture her father had developed for treating complex poisonings, spreading it thick over the wounds and wrapping them in clean bandages to hold the medicine in place. Then she moved to his broken leg, running her hands carefully over the twisted limb while he whimpered softly, feeling for the breakpoints and assessing how badly the bones had been damaged. And she was relieved to discover that while it was definitely broken in 2 places, the breaks were clean rather than shattered, which meant she could set them properly and expect them to heal if he survived the poison. Setting the leg required all her strength and made him howl with pain that tore at her heart. But she pushed through it, working with quick efficiency to align the bones correctly and splint them in place with carved wood and more bandages, all while murmuring apologies and promises that it would be over soon, that he was doing so well, that he was the bravest patient she'd ever had. She stitched the deeper gashes on his ribs with careful, precise movements, her hands steady despite her exhaustion, because this was what she'd been trained for. This was what she was good at. This was the one thing in her life that made her feel competent and valuable and necessary. She gave him water mixed with willow bark for the pain and feverfew for the fever that was making his silver fur feel hot to the touch, coaxing him to drink, even though swallowing seemed difficult for him. And throughout it all, he never tried to bite her or attack her, never fought her treatments even when they caused him obvious pain, just endured everything with that same stoic acceptance that made her heart ache with respect and admiration for his strength. By the time she finished treating all his injuries, Lyra had been working for over 4 hours, and her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her needle for the final stitches. Her entire body was screaming at her to rest, to sleep, to stop pushing herself past reasonable limits. But she couldn't. Not yet. Not until she was absolutely certain he was stable. She made herself check his vital signs one more time, pressing her ear to his massive chest to count his heartbeats and feeling the reassuring rhythm that told her the poison antidote was working, that he was fighting, that he might actually survive this if the moon goddess was merciful. Only then did Lyra finally allow herself to collapse onto the pile of blankets beside him, too exhausted to even make it back upstairs to her own bed. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her being a strange, comforting awareness of his warm presence beside her, and the feeling that for the first time in 6 months, she wasn't quite so alone anymore. She fell asleep with her hand resting on his silver fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breathing, and the silver wolf lay awake for a long time after. His ice-blue eyes watching this strange, compassionate Omega who had risked everything to save him, who had confessed her deepest pain and fears. To him thinking he was just an injured animal who couldn't understand, who had no idea that he'd heard and understood every single word she'd spoken, every confession about rejection and loneliness and feeling worthless, and he found himself wondering what this brave, broken creature would do when she woke up and discovered that the wolf she'd saved wasn't just any alpha, but the Alpha King himself, and that by bringing him into her home and treating his wounds, she'd just changed both of their destinies in ways neither of them could possibly have predicted. Midnight came and went while Lyra slept the sleep of complete exhaustion, curled up beside the massive silver wolf in her basement rehabilitation center, neither of them aware yet of the storm that was brewing outside, of the 12 elite warriors who were tracking their king's blood trail through the forest with increasing desperation, of the moment rapidly approaching when everything in Lyra's small, carefully controlled world would shatter into chaos. Because when the Silver Guard finally found their king, when they surrounded her cottage with military precision and began their siege, she would wake to discover that saving one injured wolf had drawn her into a web of politics and danger and destiny that she could never have imagined, and that the choice she'd made in that ravine, the decision to help instead of walking away, was about to either save her life or end it, and there was no way to know which until the white wolves came howling at her door. Lyra woke to the sound of howling, not the normal kind that wolves used to communicate across distances or celebrate successful hunts or call their pack members home before dawn, but something else entirely, something coordinated and military and deliberately designed to inspire terror in anyone who heard it, a sound that made every instinct in her body scream that she was in immediate and mortal danger from forces far beyond her ability to comprehend or control. Her eyes snapped open in the darkness of her basement, her heart already pounding with adrenaline-fueled panic before her conscious mind had fully processed what had woken her, and for a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why she was lying on a pile of blankets on the floor instead of in her own bed upstairs, until she felt the warm bulk of the massive silver wolf pressed against her side, and everything came rushing back in a flood of memories that made her stomach drop with fresh anxiety about all the rules she'd broken and all the dangers she'd invited into her life by making the insane decision to save him. The howling came again, closer this time, and Lyra scrambled to her feet with her legs shaking and her breath coming in short gasps, moving to the small basement window that sat at ground level and provided a limited view of the area immediately surrounding her cottage. And what she saw when she pressed her face to the cold glass made her blood turn to ice in her veins and her mind go blank with the kind of primal fear that came from suddenly realizing you were prey and the predators had found you. White wolves surrounded her cottage in a perfect circle, 12 of them that she could count from her limited vantage point. Though there might have been more positioned where she couldn't see, and they were enormous. Every single one of them at least as large as the silver wolf she'd saved, and possibly larger. Their pristine white fur seeming to glow in the moonlight that filtered through the trees and made them look like ghost warriors risen from some ancient legend to pass judgment on the living. They weren't moving, weren't attacking, just standing there in formation with the kind of disciplined coordination that spoke of extensive military training and absolute loyalty to whoever commanded them. Their heads all turned toward her cottage as if they could see through the walls and knew exactly where she was hiding. And the silence that fell after their coordinated howling was somehow even more terrifying than the sound itself, because it felt like the calm before a storm of violence that would tear her small world apart and leave nothing but blood and destruction in its wake. Lyra's hands were shaking so badly she had to press them against the windowsill to keep them steady. Her mind racing through possibilities and explanations, trying to understand what was happening and how she could possibly survive whatever was about to unfold. Because clearly these wolves were looking for the one she'd saved. Clearly they were his pack or his guards or his enemies, and she had no way of knowing if they were here to rescue him or finish what the rogues had started. No way of knowing if opening her door would mean salvation or execution for both of them. Behind her, she heard movement and turned to see the silver wolf trying to lift his head despite his injuries, his ice-blue eyes fixed on her face with an intensity that felt almost human in its focus and understanding, and she wondered not for the first time who exactly she had brought into her home. What kind of wolf commanded the attention of 12 elite warriors? What kind of power he represented that someone would go to the trouble of poisoning him and leaving him to die in a ravine instead of just killing him outright? The knock on her front door came exactly at midnight. She could see the time on the old clock her father had mounted on the basement wall. And it wasn't the tentative rap of a friend or the uncertain tap of someone seeking shelter, but a commanding blow that shook the entire structure of her small cottage and communicated authority that expected immediate obedience without question or delay. Lyra's feet felt frozen to the floor, her body unwilling to move toward that door, even though she knew that ignoring it would only make things worse, would only convince whoever was up there that she was hiding something worth breaking down her door to find. And she looked desperately at the silver wolf, as if he could somehow tell her what to do, how to handle this situation that was so far beyond her experience or understanding, that she felt like a child playing at being an adult, and suddenly discovering that the game had turned deadly serious. A voice came through the door, deep and male, and carrying the kind of absolute authority that made it clear this was someone accustomed to being obeyed without hesitation. Someone whose commands were not requests, but expectations that failure to meet would result in severe consequences that Lyra probably didn't want to discover firsthand. "Open the door," the voice said, each word precise and controlled, and somehow more frightening than shouting would have been, because it suggested complete confidence that compliance was inevitable, and resistance was not only futile, but potentially suicidal. "We know you have him. We can smell his blood from here. We mean you no harm, but we will not wait much longer for you to cooperate. And I think we both know that forcing our way in would be unfortunate for everyone involved, so let's avoid that outcome and handle this like civilized wolves, instead of making me demonstrate why the Alpha King trusts us to be his personal guard." The words hit Lyra like a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs and making her vision swim with the sudden understanding of exactly how catastrophically she had miscalculated the situation. Because the wolf she'd saved wasn't just some random alpha or elite warrior. He was the Alpha King himself, Lucian Silvercrest, the ruler of the entire Northern Territories, including the 5 major packs that owed him allegiance and tribute, the most powerful wolf in the entire region and possibly beyond. And she had touched him without permission, had put her hands all over his body while treating his injuries, had confessed her deepest insecurities and pain to him, thinking he was just an animal who couldn't understand. And according to every law she'd ever learned about hierarchy and protocol, touching an Alpha King without explicit permission was a crime that could be punished by death if he chose to interpret it as an attack or an insult to his authority. Her legs finally moved, carrying her toward the basement stairs on autopilot, while her mind screamed at her that she was walking to her own execution, that there was no way this ended well for her, that she should have left him in that ravine to die and saved herself from this nightmare scenario where she'd accidentally kidnapped the most powerful wolf in the territories and would now have to face the consequences of that monumentally stupid decision. She climbed the stairs with her heart hammering so hard she thought it might actually break through her ribs, each step feeling like it took an eternity while also arriving too quickly, her hand shaking violently as she reached for the front door and tried to make herself open it despite every survival instinct screaming at her to barricade herself inside and hope they eventually gave up and went away. Even though she knew that wasn't going to happen, knew that those 12 white wolves would tear her cottage apart board by board if that's what it took to reach their king. The silver wolf, Lucian, made a sound from the basement that carried up the stairs, not aggressive, but somehow commanding, and the effect was immediate and dramatic, because the low, threatening growl that had been building outside, a sound she'd barely registered consciously, but that had been vibrating through the walls and floor of her cottage like distant thunder, cut off instantly as if someone had flipped a switch, leaving a silence so complete that Lyra could hear her own breathing and the hammering of her pulse in her ears. She opened the door with her whole body trembling and her mind already composing apologies and explanations that would probably mean nothing in the face of whatever judgment was about to fall on her head, and found herself staring up at the tallest wolf she'd ever seen in human form, a man who had to be at least 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to fill her entire doorway, and silver hair that marked him as related somehow to the wolf in her basement, his face all sharp angles and hard edges that suggested he'd spent his life fighting and winning and had no patience for weakness or deception. His eyes, a striking pale gold that seemed to see straight through her and catalog every fear and secret she'd ever tried to hide, swept over her appearance with clinical efficiency, taking in her silver hair that was tangled and dirty from her ordeal in the forest, her pale skin that probably looked ghostly in the moonlight, her small frame that seemed even more delicate next to his massive presence, and her clothes that were still stained with blood from treating Lucian's injuries. And she saw the exact moment when his expression shifted from aggressive suspicion to something more complicated, something that might have been surprise or confusion, or possibly a reassessment of whatever conclusions he'd jumped to about her motives and character. "Where is he?" the massive warrior asked, his voice slightly less hostile than it had been through the door, but still carrying enough authority to make it clear this wasn't a request she could refuse. And Lyra had to swallow twice before she could make her voice work properly, before she could force words past the terror constricting her throat like iron bands. "In the basement," she managed to say, her voice coming out smaller and more frightened than she wanted, but at least intelligible, at least coherent enough to communicate basic information. "He's badly injured. I've been treating his wounds. There was poison in his system from the weapons the rogues used, and his leg was broken in 2 places, and he lost a lot of blood. But I think he's stable now. I think the antidote is working, and the fever is breaking, and if he can just rest for another day or two, he should be strong enough to shift back to human form without risking permanent damage." The words tumbled out of her in a rush, her healer instincts overriding her fear temporarily, as she focused on giving a medical report rather than thinking about how she was confessing to touching the Alpha King without permission. And she saw something flicker in the warrior's eyes that might have been respect or approval, or simply surprise that she was more concerned with their king's condition than with her own safety. Another figure appeared behind the first warrior, this one female and slightly smaller, but no less intimidating, with the same silver hair and the same aura of deadly competence that suggested she could kill Lyra in about 17 different ways without breaking a sweat. Her expression sharp and assessing as she studied Lyra with the kind of focus that made it clear she was categorizing every detail for potential use later. "You treated him?" the female warrior asked, her voice carrying a note of skepticism that suggested she didn't quite believe a random Omega would have the skill or resources to properly care for an Alpha King's injuries. "What qualifications do you have? What medicines did you use? How do we know you didn't make things worse or deliberately poison him further?" The accusations stung, even though Lyra understood they came from a place of protective concern rather than genuine malice, and she forced herself to meet the female warrior's eyes, even though everything in her Omega nature was screaming at her to submit and look away from this dominant wolf's challenging gaze. "My parents were traveling healers," she said, trying to keep her voice steady and professional despite her fear. "They trained me from childhood in both traditional medicine and emergency field treatment. I know every herb and tincture that grows in these territories and exactly how to use them. I've treated everything from simple infections to complex poisonings to traumatic injuries that should have been fatal, and I would never, ever deliberately harm someone who was already suffering. That goes against everything I believe in and everything my parents taught me about the sacred duty of healers to help rather than hurt." The two warriors exchanged a look that seemed to communicate volumes without words, some kind of silent conversation happening between them that Lyra couldn't interpret. And then the male warrior stepped back slightly and gestured for her to lead the way. His posture still alert and ready to react to any threat, but no longer quite so aggressively hostile as it had been when he first appeared. "Show us," he commanded, and Lyra nodded and turned back into her cottage, acutely aware of both warriors following her through her small living room, their presence making the space feel even more cramped and inadequate than usual. And she wondered what they must think of her humble home with its worn furniture and patched curtains and general air of barely maintained poverty. Whether they judged her for not having the resources or status to live somewhere more appropriate for someone who'd just saved their king's life. She led them down the basement stairs, moving carefully because the steps were narrow and steep and not designed for warriors of their size. And when they reached the bottom and the oil lamps illuminated the space she'd converted into her rehabilitation center, she heard the female warrior make a soft sound of surprise that might have been approval as she took in the professional setup, the organized medical supplies, the clean cages housing Lyra's other patients, the attention to detail that spoke of genuine expertise rather than amateur fumbling. The silver wolf, Lucian, was lying where she'd left him on the pile of clean blankets, his head raised and his ice-blue eyes fixed on the two warriors with an expression that managed to convey both command and reassurance despite his inability to speak in wolf form. And the effect on his guards was immediate and profound, both of them dropping to one knee in a gesture of respect and submission that looked automatic, instinctive, the kind of response that came from years of service and absolute loyalty. "My king," the male warrior said, his voice rough with emotion that suggested he'd been genuinely worried about Lucian's survival, and was profoundly relieved to find him alive, even if badly injured. "We've been tracking you since the ambush. We found the rogues' bodies and followed your blood trail here. We thought—" He stopped, seeming unable to finish the sentence, unable to voice whatever terrible conclusion he'd been drawing, and Lyra saw his hands clench into fists, as if he was physically restraining himself from reaching out to touch Lucian and verify that he was really there, really alive, really going to survive this. The female warrior was more composed, but no less affected, her sharp eyes sweeping over Lucian's bandaged wounds and splinted leg with the practiced assessment of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at and could evaluate the quality of treatment he'd received. "The Omega did good work," she said, directing her comment to Lucian rather than to Lyra, as if she needed his permission or approval before acknowledging Lyra's competence. "The wounds are properly cleaned and dressed. The splint is professionally applied. These bandages have some kind of poultice under them that I can smell from here. Something with bloodroot and charcoal, which are exactly what you'd use for silver poisoning, and his vital signs look stable considering what he's been through." Lucian made a soft chuffing sound that his guards seemed to understand immediately, and the male warrior stood and turned to face Lyra with an expression that was considerably less hostile than before, but still carried enough intensity to make her want to take a step backward, want to put more distance between herself and this dangerous warrior who could probably snap her neck without even trying very hard. "I am Commander Asher," he said, his voice formal but no longer quite so cold, no longer quite so ready to assume the worst about her intentions. "This is Kira. We are the Alpha King's personal guard, and we owe you a debt of gratitude for saving his life when you had no obligation to do so, when helping him put you at considerable risk, and when your own pack would probably have left him to die rather than invite trouble into their territory." The acknowledgement meant more than Lyra had expected it to. Validation from someone who clearly knew what he was talking about. Recognition that what she'd done had required courage and skill, rather than just stupid luck, and she felt something tight in her chest loosen slightly. Felt some of her fear transform into cautious hope that maybe this situation wasn't going to end with her execution after all. "I couldn't leave him there," she heard herself saying. The same explanation she'd given the patrol wolves, but somehow more honest this time, more complete. "I heard him suffering, and I have training that could help, and walking away felt like it would be betraying everything my parents taught me about using my gifts to serve others, rather than just protecting myself. And I know that sounds naive and probably stupid to warriors like you, who make decisions based on strategy and risk assessment. But I've spent 6 months feeling worthless and powerless and like I don't matter to anyone. And saving him made me feel like maybe I do have value after all. Like maybe my existence serves some purpose beyond just taking up space and being tolerated by wolves who wish I would disappear." The confession came out before she could stop it. Months of accumulated pain and loneliness spilling over in front of these strangers who had no reason to care about her emotional state, and Lyra felt her face flush with embarrassment at having revealed so much, at having shown weakness to warriors who probably saw emotional vulnerability as something to exploit rather than respect. But instead of mockery or dismissal, she saw something like understanding flash across Kira's face, saw the female warrior's expression soften in a way that suggested she knew exactly what it felt like to be undervalued and overlooked, to have your worth questioned by people who should have recognized it. "Your pack doesn't deserve you," Kira said quietly, her words carrying weight that suggested she meant them literally, rather than as empty comfort. And then she glanced at Asher, and something passed between them again. Another one of those silent conversations that happened too fast for Lyra to follow. "The king can't be moved yet," Asher said, making it a statement rather than a question, but still looking to Lyra for confirmation. And she nodded and explained that Lucian needed at least another 24 to 48 hours before the poison would be completely neutralized, and his body would be strong enough to handle the stress of transformation without risking permanent damage or death. "Then we stay," Asher decided with the kind of absolute authority that suggested he was accustomed to making command decisions and having them obeyed without question. "Most of the guard will remain hidden in the forest to avoid drawing attention, but Kira and I will stay here with rotating shifts to ensure the king's safety and to protect you from any pack members who might object to your harboring an outsider." The casual way he mentioned protecting her, as if her safety mattered to them beyond its utility in keeping their king alive, made Lyra's throat tight with emotion she didn't know how to process, because when was the last time anyone had offered to protect her? When was the last time someone had acted like her well-being was worth defending? When was the last time she'd felt like she mattered enough to warrant that kind of consideration from wolves who had no obligation to care whether she lived or died? The patrol. "Wolves know he's here," she said, forcing herself to focus on practical concerns rather than getting lost in feelings she didn't have time to examine. "They threatened to kill him yesterday when I was bringing him in, and I told them he had rabies to keep them away. But they reported it to Alpha Marcus, and he summoned me this morning. I'm supposed to appear before him to explain what I'm hiding." She saw both warriors tense at that information, saw the way their hands moved instinctively toward weapons she hadn't noticed them carrying, and realized with a sick feeling of dread that this situation was even more complicated than she'd understood. "Alpha Marcus," Asher repeated, his voice gone cold and hard in a way that made Lyra's instincts scream danger. "The king came here investigating reports of corruption and embezzlement. We had evidence that Marcus was stealing resources meant for pack welfare and using them to build his own power base, and the ambush that nearly killed our king happened while we were gathering final proof of his treachery." The implications crashed over Lyra like freezing water, understanding crystallizing with horrible clarity as all the pieces fell into place. Because if Marcus had tried to kill Lucian to prevent his investigation from being completed, then Marcus knew the Alpha King was still alive somewhere in his territory. And the summons this morning hadn't been about rabies or unauthorized guests. It had been Marcus trying to find out if she knew where Lucian was, if she was the one who'd interfered with his assassination attempt. And walking into that meeting would be walking straight into a trap designed to either extract information from her or eliminate her as a potential witness. "I can't go to that meeting," Lyra said, stating the obvious but needing to hear it confirmed, needing someone to tell her that her instinct to flee was correct rather than cowardly. "If Marcus thinks I know something, if he suspects I'm hiding the king, he'll torture me or kill me, or use me as bait to draw Lucian out, and I understand that you need to protect your king above all else. I understand that my safety is secondary to his, but I really, really don't want to die, especially not now that I've finally started to feel like my life might have some purpose beyond just existing." Kira moved closer and did something unexpected, reaching out to place a hand on Lyra's shoulder in a gesture that was probably meant to be comforting, but that made Lyra flinch because she was so unused to being touched with gentleness, so unaccustomed to physical contact that didn't come with judgment or demands or eventual rejection. "You're not going to die," Kira said with absolute certainty, with the kind of conviction that suggested she would personally fight anyone who tried to make that statement untrue. "The king has declared you under royal protection by accepting your treatment, which means harming you is the same as harming him, which means Marcus would be committing treason twice over if he touched you. Not that it will come to that, because we're going to handle this situation before it gets that far." Asher was already moving toward the stairs, his expression set in lines of grim determination that suggested he was formulating a plan and didn't particularly care if anyone else approved of it. "I need to brief the rest of the guard and set up a proper perimeter. Marcus will send wolves to collect you when you don't show up for the summons. and we need to be ready to intercept them before they reach the cottage. We need to buy time for the king to recover enough to make his identity known and strip Marcus of his authority before this escalates into open conflict that could destabilize the entire territory. Lyra wanted to ask how exactly they planned to intercept an entire pack's worth of warriors without starting the war they were trying to avoid. Wanted to point out that her cottage was going to become ground zero for a confrontation between the Alpha King's personal guard and wolves, who were probably just following orders without understanding the full scope of Marcus's treachery. But before she could voice any of those concerns, she heard something that made her blood run cold and her stomach drop straight through the floor. The sound of multiple vehicles approaching her cottage at high speed, engines growling and tires crunching over the forest path that led to her door. "They're already here," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sudden pounding of her heart. "Marcus didn't wait for me to come to him. He's coming here." Kira swore with creative profanity that would have impressed Lyra under different circumstances, and moved to the small basement window, peering out with the practiced eye of someone trained to assess tactical situations and calculate odds of survival. 6 trucks, probably 30 to 40 wolves, all armed from what I can see. This isn't a collection party. This is a raid. Marcus is making his move now, while he thinks the king is too weak to stop him. Asher was already halfway up the stairs, his body moving with the fluid grace of a warrior shifting into combat mode, his voice carrying clearly back down to them as he barked orders that Lyra couldn't quite hear, but that sounded urgent and commanding and absolutely certain about what needed to happen next. Lyra looked at Lucian, at the massive silver wolf who was trying to rise despite his injuries, his eyes blazing with fury and frustration that he couldn't defend himself or his people, couldn't shift to human form and take command of the situation because his body was still too weak, still too poisoned, still too broken to do what his position and his instincts demanded. She moved to his side without thinking, placing her hands on his massive head in a gesture that was probably presumptuous and possibly insulting, but that felt necessary in that moment, necessary to communicate that she understood his frustration, but that he needed to stay down, needed to let his body heal, needed to trust that his guards knew what they were doing and could handle this threat without him. "You have to stay still," she said firmly, using the same tone she used with her other patients when they tried to move before they were ready. Authoritative but gentle, commanding but caring. "I didn't drag you through miles of forest and spend hours treating your injuries just so you could tear all my work apart by trying to fight when your body isn't ready. And I know you're the Alpha King, and you're used to being in control and making the decisions. But right now, you need to let others protect you for once. You need to accept that being vulnerable doesn't make you weak, and that allowing people to help you is actually a sign of strength rather than failure." She didn't know where the words were coming from, didn't know what gave her the courage to speak to the Alpha King like he was one of her rescue animals rather than the most powerful wolf in the territories. But something about the way he was looking at her, something about the intelligence and understanding in those ice blue eyes, made her feel like he was really hearing her, really listening in a way that no one else ever had. The sound of truck doors slamming and boots hitting the ground came from outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of wolves shifting in preparation for violence, and Lyra felt her hands start shaking again. Felt the fear come rushing back now that the immediate distraction of treating Lucian was gone, and she had to face the reality that dozens of armed warriors were about to storm her cottage looking for the king she'd been hiding. Kira appeared at the bottom of the stairs, moving with supernatural speed, her expression set in lines of fierce determination, as she positioned herself between the basement door and Lucian, clearly prepared to defend her king with her life if necessary. And Lyra realized with a strange sense of detachment that she was about to witness actual combat, about to see wolves tear each other apart right here in her home, and there was nothing she could do to stop it because she was just a healer, just an Omega, just someone who fixed broken things rather than breaking them. "Stay down here with the king," Kira commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. "Lock the door behind me. Don't open it for anyone except Asher or me, and if things go badly, if we fall, there's a tunnel in the back corner behind that stack of supply crates that leads out to the forest. Take the king and run as fast as you can toward the northern border. Keep running until you reach the royal territory, and tell whoever you meet that you're under the protection of the Silver Guard, and they'll get you to safety." The casual way Kira discussed her own potential death, the matter-of-fact acceptance that she might not survive the next hour, made Lyra want to cry or scream or do something to acknowledge the enormous sacrifice these warriors were prepared to make for their king. But there was no time for any of that because footsteps were already thundering across her front porch, and someone was hammering on her door with enough force to crack the wood. Derek's voice came through the door, aggressive and entitled, and carrying a note of vicious satisfaction that made Lyra's skin crawl with remembered humiliation and fresh hatred. Because of course, Marcus would send her ex-fiancé to collect her. Of course he would use the one wolf who'd already hurt her the most to hurt her again, because that's what wolves like Marcus and Derek did. They found your weaknesses and exploited them without mercy or remorse. "Lyra!" Derek shouted, his voice carrying clearly even through the wooden door and down into the basement, where she stood frozen with fear and rage warring in her chest. "Open this door right now! Alpha's orders! You were supposed to report this morning and you didn't show! Which means you're in violation of direct commands, which means we have authority to enter by force and drag you out if necessary. So you can either cooperate and make this easy, or you can resist and make it very, very painful. Your choice." Lyra heard Asher's voice respond from somewhere outside. Couldn't make out the words, but could hear the tone, cold and commanding, and absolutely unimpressed by Derek's threats. And then there was a moment of shocked silence followed by Derek's voice again, but different this time, uncertain and confused, and starting to sound genuinely worried. "Who the hell are you? This is pack business. You have no authority here. You need to leave immediately before you're charged with trespassing and interference." Another voice responded, multiple voices actually, and Lyra realized that the Silver Guard had revealed themselves, had stepped out of the forest and taken positions around her cottage, and she could imagine the scene playing out above her. Could picture Derek and his warriors suddenly finding themselves surrounded by 12 elite soldiers who were all larger and more skilled and infinitely more dangerous than anyone Marcus had sent on this raid. Lucian made a sound behind her, a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards and seemed to shake the very foundations of her cottage. And Lyra turned to see him standing, despite his injuries, standing with his teeth bared and his eyes blazing with an alpha dominance so powerful, it made the air feel thick and heavy, made it hard to breathe, made every instinct in her Omega nature scream at her to submit, to drop to her knees, to bare her throat in acknowledgement of his absolute authority. But she didn't submit, couldn't submit, because he was injured and vulnerable and trying to do something incredibly stupid. And someone needed to stop him before he hurt himself worse than the poison had, before he tore open all the careful stitches she'd placed and undid all the healing his body had managed over the past day. "Don't you dare!" she said, moving back to his side and placing her hands on his chest, feeling the rapid beating of his heart under her palms, feeling the fever heat that still radiated from his body despite the antidote she'd administered. "I will sedate you if I have to. I will drug you unconscious and tie you down, if that's what it takes to keep you from killing yourself. and I don't care if that's treason or disrespect or whatever other crime you want to charge me with later. Right now, you are my patient, and I am responsible for your recovery, and that means you are going to lie back down and let your people handle this situation while you focus on not dying. Do you understand me? She was dimly aware that she was speaking to the Alpha King like he was a misbehaving child, that she was touching him without permission again, that she was probably making everything worse and guaranteeing her own execution once this crisis was over. But in that moment, none of that mattered as much as keeping him alive, as much as making sure all her work and all his suffering wasn't wasted because he was too stubborn and too proud to accept help when he needed it most. Something shifted in Lucian's eyes as he looked down at her, something that might have been surprise or amusement, or possibly respect. And then slowly, very slowly, he allowed his legs to fold and lowered himself back down to the blankets, though his eyes never left hers, and she could see the frustration and the fear warring in that ice-blue gaze, could see how much it cost him to lie there helpless while his people fought to protect him. The sounds of confrontation from above intensified, shouting and snarling, and the distinctive sound of flesh hitting flesh. And Lyra's hands clenched into fists as she resisted the urge to run upstairs and see what was happening, to verify that Kira and Asher were okay, to do something useful instead of just cowering in the basement while others fought and bled on her behalf. "They'll be fine," she whispered, more to herself than to Lucian, trying to make herself believe it despite the evidence of her ears. "They're elite warriors. They've trained for situations like this. They know what they're doing. They'll be fine." But even as she spoke the words, even as she tried to convince herself they were true, she heard a sound that made her blood run cold, a voice she recognized as Asher's shouting a warning that was cut off mid-word by something that sounded horribly final. And then there was a crash and the sound of something heavy hitting the floor directly above them. And Lyra knew with sickening certainty that the fight had moved inside her cottage, that Marcus's wolves had breached the front door, that the battle was no longer outside where she could pretend it wasn't really happening, but was now in her home, in her space, getting closer to the basement door with every passing second. And she and Lucian were about to be discovered by wolves who would kill them both without hesitation if given the chance, and there was nowhere left to run, and no time left to hide, and absolutely no way this was going to end with both of them surviving. The basement door exploded inward with a force that sent splinters of wood flying across the room like deadly projectiles, and Lyra barely had time to throw herself over Lucian's injured body in a desperate attempt to shield him before 3 of Marcus's warriors came pouring down the stairs with their weapons drawn, and their eyes gleaming with the kind of bloodlust that came from winning a fight they'd expected to lose, from overwhelming opposition that should have been superior, but had somehow been caught off guard, or outnumbered, or simply unprepared for the level of brutality that Marcus had authorized his wolves to employ in order to capture the Alpha King and eliminate anyone who'd helped him. Lyra felt Lucian tense beneath her, felt the rumble of a growl building in his massive chest as he prepared to fight despite his injuries, despite the fact that he was still too weak to shift and too damaged to defend himself properly, and she pressed her hands harder against his fur, silently begging him to stay down, to let her handle this, even though she had no idea how to handle armed warriors who wanted them both dead, even though her only weapons were words and hope, and the desperate prayer that somehow, impossibly, this situation could still be resolved without everyone she cared about ending up slaughtered on her basement floor. The lead warrior, a scarred male with cold eyes and a cruel smile that made Lyra's stomach turn with visceral disgust, took in the scene before him with obvious satisfaction. his gaze moving from Lyra's protective position over the silver wolf to the medical supplies scattered around the room to the other animals watching nervously from their cages, and she saw the exact moment when he recognized what he was looking at, when he understood that the injured wolf wasn't just some random alpha, but was someone important enough to warrant this level of care and protection. "Well, well," he said, his voice dripping with false amusement that barely concealed the violence simmering beneath his casual tone. "Alpha Marcus was right to be suspicious. Looks like our little ghost Omega has been harboring secrets, and not just any secrets, but the kind that get entire packs executed for treason against the rightful territorial authority." He took a step closer, and Lyra forced herself to stand, even though every instinct screamed at her to cower, to submit, to make herself small and unthreatening in hopes that he might show mercy. But she'd spent 6 months being small and unthreatening, and it had gotten her nothing but more rejection and more pain, and she was done, absolutely done, with letting fear dictate her choices and allowing others to make her feel worthless just because they had more power or more status or more willingness to hurt people who couldn't fight back. "That wolf is under my protection and under my care," Lyra said, and her voice came out stronger than she'd expected, steadier than she had any right to sound, given how terrified she actually was, carrying a conviction that surprised even her, because she meant it. She really meant it. She would die protecting Lucian if that's what it took, because saving him had given her life meaning for the first time in months, and she wasn't going to let Marcus's thugs undo all her work and all her sacrifice, just because some corrupt alpha was trying to cover up his crimes. "You need to leave my home immediately. You have no authority to be here. You're trespassing on private property and threatening a healer who's committed no crime except fulfilling the sacred duty that all healers owe to those who are suffering, and I'm pretty sure the moon goddess herself would have some opinions about wolves who interfere with that duty and prevent healers from doing their work." The scarred warrior laughed, a sound devoid of any genuine humor, and the 2 wolves flanking him moved to spread out in a classic tactical formation that suggested they were preparing to attack from multiple angles simultaneously, making it impossible for even a healthy alpha to defend against all of them at once, much less an injured Omega and a wolf who could barely stand. "The moon goddess isn't here to protect you," the warrior said, pulling a wicked-looking blade from his belt and examining it with casual interest that was clearly meant to intimidate her. "But Alpha Marcus is, and he's given us very clear orders about what to do with traitors who harbor his enemies and interfere with pack justice. So here's how this is going to work. You're going to step away from that wolf, you're going to come with us quietly, and we're going to finish what the rogue started and put that animal down like the diseased creature it is, and if you cooperate and tell us everything you know about who else might be involved in this conspiracy, Marcus might show mercy and make your death quick instead of dragging it out for days while he extracts every last bit of information from your screaming mouth." Lyra felt Lucian surge beneath her at those words, felt the fury rolling off him in waves so powerful they made the air shimmer with heat and dominance, and she knew he was about to do something catastrophically stupid, about to try fighting these warriors despite his broken leg and his poisoned wounds and his complete inability to shift. And she couldn't let that happen. Couldn't let him throw away his life and his kingdom and his future, just to protect her from consequences that were ultimately her own fault for making the choice to save him in the first place. But before either of them could move, before the scarred warrior could take another step closer, with his blade raised and his intentions clear, there was a sound from the top of the basement stairs that made everyone freeze. A sound that started as a low rumble and built into a roar so powerful it shook dust from the rafters and made the oil lamps flicker wildly. A sound that carried such absolute authority and such overwhelming alpha dominance that every wolf in the room, including Lyra, despite her determination to stay strong, dropped automatically into submissive postures with their heads bowed and their throats exposed, their bodies responding to a command that bypassed conscious thought and went straight to the most primal instincts that governed wolf hierarchy and pack structure. Asher appeared at the top of the stairs, battered and bleeding from multiple wounds, but very much alive and very much furious, his eyes blazing with the kind of rage that came from seeing his king threatened, and his mission compromised, and his trust violated by wolves who should have known better than to challenge the authority of the Silver Guard. "You made a serious mistake coming down here," Asher said, his voice cold enough to freeze blood in veins and sharp enough to cut through bone. "That wolf you're threatening is Lucian Silvercrest, Alpha King of the Northern Territories, and by raising your weapons against him, you've committed treason, which carries a penalty of immediate execution without trial or appeal. So I'm going to give you one chance, exactly one chance, to drop those weapons and submit to royal custody, and if you're smart, you'll take it because the alternative is me tearing you apart with my bare hands and enjoying every single second of it." The scarred warrior's face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession, confusion giving way to disbelief, giving way to dawning horror, as he realized exactly how catastrophically he'd miscalculated. How Marcus had sent them after the Alpha King without telling them who they were actually attacking, how they'd just committed treason of the highest order, and there was no possible way to walk this back, or claim ignorance, or escape the consequences that were about to fall on their heads like the wrath of the moon goddess herself. His blade clattered to the floor, followed quickly by the weapons of his two companions, and all three warriors dropped to their knees with their heads bowed so low their foreheads touched the ground in a gesture of complete submission and desperate supplication, clearly hoping that showing proper deference now might somehow save them from execution, even though they'd already crossed lines that couldn't be uncrossed and committed crimes that couldn't be forgiven. Kira appeared behind Asher, looking equally battered, but wearing a savage smile that suggested the fight outside had gone considerably better than the sounds had indicated, that the Silver Guard had successfully subdued or eliminated the majority of Marcus's raiding party, and were now in complete control of the situation. And Lyra felt something in her chest unclench slightly, felt the terror that had been choking her since those trucks arrived start to ease just enough that she could breathe properly again, could think clearly enough to process what was happening beyond just the immediate threat to her and Lucian's survival. "The rest of Marcus's wolves are secured," Kira reported, addressing Asher but clearly intending her words for Lucian as well, acknowledging their king, even though he couldn't respond in his current form. "We've got 32 prisoners total, including Derek Blackwood, who was extremely vocal about his innocence and his lack of knowledge regarding the king's identity, though his father Gregory was considerably less surprised when we revealed who we were protecting, which suggests he was aware of Marcus's assassination plot and may have been directly involved in its planning and execution." At the mention of Derek's name, Lyra felt something twist in her chest, not pain exactly, but a complicated mixture of vindication and pity and residual hurt that came from knowing her ex-fiancé had been part of the conspiracy to kill Lucian, had been willing to participate in treason and murder just to advance his own political ambitions and secure his position in Marcus's regime. She looked down at Lucian and found him watching her with those ice-blue eyes that seemed to see straight through to her soul, that seemed to understand exactly what she was feeling and why. And she wondered not for the first time what it must be like to be him, to carry the weight of an entire kingdom on your shoulders, to know that trust was a luxury you couldn't afford because betrayal could come from anyone at any time, to spend your life surrounded by people but still fundamentally alone, because no one could truly understand the burden of leadership and the isolation that came with absolute power. Asher moved down the stairs with Kira, following close behind, both of them keeping their bodies between the captured warriors and their king in a protective formation that spoke of years of training and absolute dedication to Lucian's safety. And Lyra finally allowed herself to step away from Lucian's side now that the immediate danger had passed. Her legs shaking so badly, she had to lean against the wall to keep from collapsing, as the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright drained away and left her feeling hollow and exhausted and slightly disconnected from reality, as if she was watching everything happen from a great distance rather than actively participating in events that would probably define the rest of her life. "Take them upstairs and secure them with the others," Asher ordered, gesturing to the 3 warriors still kneeling on the floor. "Make sure Gregory and Marcus are kept separated. I want to question them individually before the king is ready to pass judgment. And send someone to fetch the pack healer because we've got wounded that need attention. Though obviously nothing that interferes with the Omega's work since the king's recovery takes absolute priority over everything else." The captured warriors were hauled to their feet and marched up the stairs under heavy guard, their faces showing the kind of resignation that came from knowing their fates were sealed, and there was nothing left to do but accept whatever punishment was coming. And Lyra found herself feeling an unexpected flicker of sympathy for them, because they'd probably just been following orders, just trying to do what their alpha commanded without understanding the full context or the real consequences. And now they were going to pay the price for Marcus's ambition and corruption and willingness to commit murder in pursuit of power. Once the prisoners were gone, and it was just Lyra, Lucian, Asher, and Kira in the basement, the atmosphere shifted from crisis management to something more intimate, more personal, as if they could finally acknowledge the emotional weight of everything that had just happened now that the immediate physical danger had passed, and they had space to process their fear and relief and the overwhelming awareness of how close they'd all come to dying in the last hour. "You did well," Asher said, directing the comment to Lyra with an expression that was far warmer than anything she'd seen from him before, showing respect and approval that felt like the highest compliment she could possibly receive from a warrior of his caliber and experience. Standing up to armed warriors when you're an unarmed Omega takes courage that most trained soldiers don't possess, and protecting the king with your own body when you knew they'd have to go through you to reach him is the kind of selfless loyalty that defines true character. So whatever your pack has told you about your worth, whatever lies they've made you believe about being too soft or too weak or too different to matter, I want you to know that you're wrong. You matter more than you could possibly understand, and what you did today will be remembered and honored for as long as the Silver Guard exists. The words hit Lyra like a physical impact, knocking loose something that had been lodged in her chest since Derek's rejection, since that terrible moment when she'd been told in front of everyone that she wasn't good enough, that her compassion was a flaw, that her differences made her worthless, and she felt tears start streaming down her face before she could stop them. Felt months of accumulated pain and self-doubt and carefully suppressed grief come pouring out in great racking sobs that shook her entire body and left her gasping for air between waves of emotion too powerful to contain or control. Kira moved to her side with surprising gentleness for someone who'd just been fighting for her life, wrapping an arm around Lyra's shoulders and pulling her into an embrace that felt nothing like the awkward, obligatory physical contact she'd received from pack members who tolerated her presence, but rather like genuine affection and sisterly protection and the kind of belonging she'd been craving since her parents died and left her alone in a world that found her too strange to love. "Let it out," Kira murmured, her voice soft, but carrying the authority of someone who knew exactly what Lyra was feeling because she'd felt it herself at some point, had experienced her own rejection and pain, and had learned how to transform that suffering into strength. You've been holding this inside for too long, carrying weight that was never yours to bear in the first place, believing lies that other people told you because they couldn't see your value. But we see you, Lyra Nightshade. We see exactly who you are and what you're capable of, and you are extraordinary. The validation from these warriors who had no reason to lie to her, who gained nothing from making her feel better except perhaps the satisfaction of acknowledging truth when they encountered it, meant more than Lyra could possibly express in words, meant more than any amount of acceptance from her old pack would have meant, because this came from people who'd witnessed her at her most vulnerable and her most brave, and had judged her worthy based on her actions rather than her appearance or her rank or her ability to navigate social politics she'd never understood or cared about. A sound from Lucian drew their attention back to the massive silver wolf, and Lyra saw immediately that something was different, that the fever brightness in his eyes had faded and been replaced by a clarity that suggested the poison had finally been neutralized completely, that his body had reached some critical threshold of healing that would allow him to shift back to human form if he chose to, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and nervousness because once he could speak, once he could properly communicate instead of just watching and listening and being trapped in wolf form, everything would change between them in ways she couldn't predict or control. "You need to rest before you try shifting," she said automatically, her healer instincts overriding her awareness that she was once again telling the Alpha King what to do without any real authority to give him orders. "Your body has been through tremendous trauma, and transformation puts incredible stress on already damaged systems. So ideally, you should wait another full day before attempting it. Give your wounds more time to close, and your strength more time to rebuild, and I know you're probably desperate to take your human form and deal with Marcus and make decisions, and generally be in control again. But rushing this could cause permanent damage or kill you. And that would be a tremendous waste of all the effort we've put into keeping you alive." Lucian's eyes met hers with an intensity that made her breath catch, made her acutely aware of how close they were standing, made her remember every intimate moment from the past 2 days when she'd touched him and talked to him and shown him parts of herself she'd never revealed to anyone else. And she saw something in that ice blue gaze that looked like promise, like acknowledgement of a connection that went deeper than healer and patient, deeper than Omega and King, deeper than anything she'd experienced before and didn't quite know how to name or define. If you enjoyed Lyra and Lucian's story of how one act of compassion in a dark forest changed 2 lives forever and brought together an unlikely pair who proved that true love transcends status and rank and all the arbitrary rules that try to keep people apart, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss another tale of werewolf romance, fated mates, alpha kings, and omegas who discover their own strength and worth despite a world that tries to convince them they're not enough. Hit that notification bell to be alerted whenever I post new stories, and leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this journey from rejection to redemption, from loneliness to belonging, from a basement full of broken creatures to a kingdom full of hope and possibility. Because your thoughts and reactions and connections to these characters mean everything to me and help me understand what stories resonate most deeply with all of you. What did you think of Lyra's courage in saving Lucian despite the danger? Did Derek get what he deserved? Or should his punishment have been different? What other werewolf romance themes would you like me to explore in future stories? Share your thoughts in the comments, and thank you so much for reading and for being part of this community of people who believe in the transformative power of love and kindness and choosing to help others even when it costs us something. Because that's what these stories are really about at their core. The ways that compassion and courage can heal wounds we thought were permanent and create futures we thought were impossible. And I'll see you in the next story where we'll explore more tales of wolves finding their mates and their purposes and their places in a world that's bigger and more magical than any of us can fully comprehend.